My name is Willie Pekah. I'm from the Comanche Nation. I'm a traditional bow and arrow maker. I've been doing this since about 9 years old, so now that puts me about 61 years. Today, we're going to talk about making a traditional Comanche arrow. The process going from getting it cut in the creek, what to look for when you cut the dogwood, down to getting it processed, making it look like an arrow shaft. I'll talk about everything, how to do the nock, put the feathers on, the points, talk to you about how Comanches made them hundreds of years ago to make them traditional. Now when I go into the creek to cut all the shafts, this is what it looks like in the creek. This is dogwood. I did research it for Oklahoma. There's about 17 varieties of dogwood, okay? And the best place to find them is along the creek or inside a boggy area. I like to go inside a boggy area where there's a lot of trees. That way, when the shafts grow, they grow to the sun. They get a lot straighter. If you get them outside the edge of the creek and stuff, they're too much bent and they sway around too much. But I try to look for different dogwood shafts, and I try to get them close to the arrow that I want to make. You got to allow for the bark to be taken off, okay? And one of the things that the old guys were telling me is how to find dogwood that works for you and makes a good arrow. And I was told when you're making one, you select it where it's long enough for your arrow. I make them about 27, 28 inches, okay? But when you find them in a creek, they need to be a little bit larger than your regular shaft. That way you take the bark down and shape them, everything, it comes down to this, which works out nice. But getting back to the point of where we're selecting the arrows, I was told by the old arrow makers, when you use a dogwood, try to get where you see the limbs here. That's where you want to put the nock of your arrow. That's where you want to put the nock of the arrow, right here in that. When you've got these limbs coming out, it's kind of like the burl effect of a tree. The wood is real dense there, and opposed to be down at the bottom where you have straighter grain layers that go this way. Up here, it kind of intermingles. So that's the best place to make the arrow nock. It is stronger, and it doesn't tend to split when you put the string there. So it's the best place for it. And I've found out through the years that's where I put my nock. So I start here, then I go down to the length that I want. That's how I usually gauge it, from the nock to where the point goes in the front. What I do is, when I get a piece, first thing you got to do, once you size it up, where you got your limbs are for your back end, you just have to start working them. And what I do is I start shaving them down, and you just got to work them down. Shave it down, shave it down. It's a lot of work, but that's the way I do it. If you got a better way, fine with me, but you got to take that bark off. And as I'm shaving it down, I just rotate the knife and the shaft, so it just keeps coming off. And when you get to those knots, the knots, you got to cut them off just a little bit, because you want to eventually work those down, okay? So you take those off as you're going, and then keep working and taking it down. And that's the process. It takes a while. It's just something that doesn't happen. And when I go cut, I make so many nowadays, I've got to have about 150 or so of these that last me through the years, because once I get it all cut up, I bundle them together straighten them as best I can, because it comes crooked in the creek, but they're still green and you can work them. So I work them and get them straight, and then when I get them all settled where they're down, I like to bundle them. I bundle them in sevens. That way you get one in the center and they all go around it. Okay? That way, when you get them, they're pulling against each other, you tighten them up where they all stay straight as much as you can. I bundle them, and about a week or so later, I'll unbundle them and keep working it down with a knife or sandpaper, where you do to get those knocks off, and just to keep working them till you get them to where you want. Okay? Once I do that, then I go ahead and worry about, backing up. When you're sanding these, you've got little spaces where the limbs were, okay? And those are usually raised where the limbs were coming out. So when you're sanding them, I get a block. Doesn't matter, you can make your own. You need to be about 6-8 inches. That way when you sand those down, it sands them flat with the length of a arrow shaft. So it doesn't dig in if you had little bit. So just, run them, and it gives you a straighter arrow if you sand them down like that. And you finally get a shaft that'll work for you. And you're gonna find out it's that when you get them in the creek, they're full of moisture, they're heavy. As you cure them and dry them out, they get much lighter. They make a great arrow. They're stronger, and they will work better, so you don't have to worry about them, and they stay straight. After I put the knock in the back, what I try to do is I cut the knock down, and you'll see where it kind of shapes in. I cut them down. The reason I do that is that's where the knock is going to be for the string to come in. So I'll put them to a shape like that, and then I get a file to the size that I want for my string to go, and then I just take it down the middle, and you just cut your knock in. And remember, that's where those limbs came out on these sides, so that's pretty dense right there, and it makes a great knock for it. And that's the way these come out. When I shape them down, you've got the knock that comes in right here. Then I start putting on the feathers and other things. Okay, now to keep it straight, and one thing that the elders taught me is Comanches, they called it a blood groove. So there's a groove down the whole length of the arrow on 3 sides. Like I said, they call it a blood groove, so when it goes in, it's still supposed to let the blood come out. I found out later it adds to the strength of the arrow. It's kind of like I always call the tin horn effect. Where you got a tin horn, it makes it so much stronger. Same way with the groove. A groove brings it in, and your arrows stay stronger, and it's wood. You always straighten them, but I found out if you put the groove in, they last and stay stronger longer, opposed to not having the groove. So that's one thing that Comanches always did, was put the blood grooves. They're a pain to do, but it pays off in the long run. Now how I put the grooves in, this is off a rib bone, and they had usually some kind of point that came through. I use a screw where you got a knock where it goes on your arrow, okay? And then that little screw is sharpened where it fits on your groove that you're making. And I just work it back and forth, work it back and forth. And I get that groove where I want it. And like I said, it adds to the strength and of the arrow, which you guys call the blood groove. It's a great process. It's just hard to do. You've got so many things to do just to make a good arrow. And that's the way the elders made them. So I try to reproduce them. I can't cut corners as much as I can, but I've adapted to the new ways, and like having sandpaper and things like that. Now, to the points, the Comanches made several different kinds of points. The progression for Comanche arrows was when they first started making arrows, they didn't know about the points, how they figured it out. I have no idea, but in the beginning, they just sharpened the point. Just a sharp point where it would go in things. Through the years and progression of developing arrows, they went from points, then they learned how to make them out of bone. Bone was the next one. Now this is the buffalo rib bone that I use. And I'll show you how to do those in a minute, different points that they've used. But it went from just a straight point to a buffalo point. And then when Americans moved in and the frontier, they would find metal. And one of the things in the beginning they liked to use was that metal that goes around the wagon wheel. They would take chunks and shape it into a point. The problem we had with the wagon wheel is that metal was so heavy that when you shot your arrow, it's called dipping. It goes and then it drops, okay, because it was too heavy in the front end. Through the years of seeing the frontier, they went to a different metal. They found the old hand saws that some of the carpenters would use and shaped that into a metal point. Now these are so rigid, and those old hand saws, you can put a razor edge on each one. So these can be so sharp, but I don't do that because people, touch them and they move around, and they would do that. But they would take an old handsaw, and what they would do is you have the handsaw, and then you put a pattern on it, and score your pattern on that handsaw, and mark it on that metal handsaw, and then you take a cold chisel along that handsaw on your pattern, a cold chisel, and just score it. You don't want to break it all the way through because it's a cold metal. So once you make your line all the way through, you just get a piece of pliers and break it. And it just snaps off. And then you're left with this. Then you take it, you just take it to a grinder. You can take a file and shape it down to the way you want it. And usually I try to come out something like this. Different sizes they would have for the points. Everybody had a different way. Some was smaller, straighter, and some were longer. That's how they would do the metal points. But they're light, and they can really put an edge on it. And that's from an old handsaw. Now, the way they would do the bone points, and I found out through different bone points, I would use a buffalo rib bone, a big rib bone that they would come. I would cut sections out of it in the rib bone. And then when I get it cut out, then I take a knife on each one and split it, and it would come apart. From then, I would shave it down. Right now, you would do however you want to shave it down, but I get a little little sander, and I grind these down to where I have a flat piece. It comes into this, and it makes a beautiful little point. They look really original, but it would come down to from this, grinding it down to this. Then you would go ahead and get your pattern, put it on there, and work it. Mark it, then you would take it back to the sander and work it down to where you need it. And this is what I come out with. These are the points that I'm making for a set of arrows for a guy. And they're pretty nice. They look good. So your options is a straight point, which nowadays I use for target practice. You don't need to put a metal tip on it. You just sharpen them, because dogwood, once you harden the end, what I do is put it in a fire and darken it and shape it a little bit and get a point. And I use those for my target points. And then when I'm making them for traditional guys, I would either use the metal or the bone points for whatever they prefer. And that's how you do it. Now, when you get back to making the metal points, what I found out when I make it out of the hand saws, that before I put the point on, you've got to put that groove into them. And I found out that if you get a hacksaw and cut your groove, the width of the blade is the same as the metal from the handsaw. So once you cut your groove down with the hacksaw, it makes a beautiful point. Then you can just slide it in. You got to cut it deep enough to get where you want, where it comes out, where it sets in far enough. Then you would take your I used to use imitation sinew, but I make so many nowadays that I use imitation sinew. So once you get your point in, put some glue in there, tie it down, and I just wrap it. That's all I do. Wrap it tight, and it makes a beautiful point. Okay. Now, back to the original part is the feathers. Now, the part I need to tell you about is cutting the feathers. Comanche feathers were always, we made them. They were 5, 6, 8 inches long, the length of the feathers. I settled on about 5.5 inches or so. I cut them long, and I've cut so many that I had to develop something to cut them. It was all right to have a feather, but then you take a scissors and they're always different. So what I developed was I made a pattern that fit my feather that I needed, that I was going to use. Okay, so I got the one that I wanted and I made a pattern. What I do is put it on the feathers that I'm cutting. I put on pieces of tape, and then you just wrap it around. Bump it up to the vein, wrap it over. And that stays right there where you need it. Okay? Then I would get a piece of masking tape, put it on the back. Then I would cut this out. You want to allow a little bit in the back to attach it to the arrow, so maybe just less than a half an inch. You can always cut it as you need, but cut that up here. Then you would cut it down and around, then leave some in the front. That's the easiest way. That way, when you cut it, you don't have feathers flying all over the place. You don't have to find feathers over here. So what you do, once you cut it, and you just take this off, and it's got those feathers that you cut on the tape, then you have a pile of tape. Get your pattern, go to the next one, and that's what you come out with to attach to your arrow. It's a great process. I was teaching at a class one time, and one guy said, I made a buckle for my son. He said, that's a great idea to, tie your feathers down. A couple things that it does. Once you attach it, it doesn't let this move at all when you're cutting with scissors. See, it's tied on the masking tape, so you just cut it out the way you want it. He said, man, if I knew that, I wouldn't have got in trouble. He said, my wife is complaining at feathers all over the house. But it works the same process if you want a different pattern for a feather. So it's great to use for other things too. So to put the feathers on, the Comanches are the only ones that I know of that do this. In the beginning, they didn't have glue, developed the glue. So one thing that you'll find out that Comanches did is they tied their feathers on the back. You can see where I got a little bent area, so it's tied on. So once you tie it on and it's laid backwards, what Comanche did once you get them on, you tie them on like this and you bend them forward. That way you can put more pressure on them pulling down, so it makes you tie the arrow. If you just laid it flat in the back, it would pull out. That way we tied them from the back forward. I always had the old guys, they always ask me, they always say, son, do you make those Hollywood style or do you make them Comanche style? Comanche style was where they tied them in the back, pulled them over, then tied them in the front. That's without any glue. Nowadays I try to glue them down because when people buy them, they want them to last longer. The old days, when they made them, they just retied them whenever they needed to. But that was a style that Comanches find out. You'll only find that Comanches, and I've only found, I've been doing this for 61 years, are the only ones that tie it from the back, pull it over, and that's Comanche arrow. The other thing that we do is some of our people, you'll see in the picture, I use a style from Chief Wild Horse. I'm a descendant of Wild Horse. We take the plumes, and he was saying that it was part of his medicine, that when he put the feathers on in the front, he would put the plumes on at the front. He said it was part of his medicine. So, okay, not me go above medicine. I started putting them on. He's one of my ancestors, elders, so I would tie the plumes on and then tie the string down, wrap it down all the way around. That's where you would get to the plumes that we have. All of my arrows, I make them like this. You'll find out we used dark arrow feathers, he did anyway, with the plumes on. Now you can develop that into anything you want. Another guy, he ordered these. His tribal colors were red, white, and blue. So he wanted red and white, blue feathers. And then I put the points on for him. He can use these dance with. So that's a different progression of all the arrows. I love using dogwood. The elders said, as they travel, Comanches travel all the way from kind of Kansas, all the way down to Mexico, over to Arkansas, to New Mexico. That was our area. We'd go north in the summertime, following the buffalo. We'd go south in the winter, following the buffalo again, because they were everything for us. But as they traveled, if they couldn't find dogwood, they would use anything straight. Sometimes a cherry tree had shoots on it, and they would make a good arrow shaft. They've used reeds from the creek, anything straight. They were traveling. They need to do these all the time. And I was asking my one elder, said, okay, they were traveling in teepees and trying to make arrows. He said they made arrows all the time because you had to have them to hunt, protect your people. So they were always cutting arrow shafts wherever they went and bundle them. I said, okay, how'd they cure them? I was wanting to know how to cure them. He said they would bundle them and hang them up in the top of the teepee where the heat goes up, and it would cure them. They would take them down and work them. And the process used was just long and tedious, but it made a great arrow. I love working with dogwood because, like I said, once you get it down and cure it, it's light, but it's strong. Makes a good one. Thank you, Uda, for my people.